Hey everyone, in this video I want to talk a little bit more about technological problems, specifically the kind of problems that technology creates or magnifies. And I want to do this in order to provide a little bit more context and rationale for the attempts that we're going to make at implementing technological practices, habits, and disciplines that reclaim and restore our personal agency. One of the problems that has come with our screens and digital technologies, of course, is an inability to focus and pay attention. We now experience what Michael Harris calls continuous partial attention. That's our kind of baseline now. We're never quite fully paying attention for any sustained length of time. Now, given that this is our new baseline, some people claim that, well, they're really good at multitasking, doing things like checking their phones while watching movies or while driving or while sitting with someone else for a chat over coffee. But scientifically speaking, there's actually no such thing as multitasking. As Sherry Turkle, a professor at MIT, explains in her book Alone Together, when psychologists study multitasking, they do not find a story of new efficiencies. Rather, multitaskers don't perform as well on any of the tasks that they're attempting. The reason is because, as Michael Harris notes, instead of multitasking, what we're actually doing is multi-switching. That is, what the brain is very good at doing, quickly diverting its attention from one place to the next. That quick diversion actually helps to keep us alive. Our brains are actively scoping out for danger every second. This is part of our brain's orienting responses. As Harris once more explains, orienting responses served us well in the wilderness of our species' early years. When the light changes in your peripheral vision, you must look at it because that could be the shadow of something that's about to eat you. If a twig snaps behind you, ditto. Having evolved in an environment rife with danger and uncertainty, we are hardwired to always default to fast-paced shifts in focus. Orienting responses are the brain's ever-armed alarm system and cannot be ignored. Now consider that. If that's how our brains work, then it's no wonder that we are so distracted by flashes of light and the dings and pings from our notifications and ads that flood our smartphones. But we aren't merely distracted by them, we're stimulated by them. As Mary Swingle notes, any screen time at all stimulates neurologically, even if we assume we're doing something relaxing. This is why it is sometimes difficult to fall asleep or even to sleep well through the night if we've been on our phones or laptops leading up to bedtime. Additionally, even if all we do is merely leave our phones on, not even use them actively, this keeps us in a state of constant anticipating of rewards, which again is both distracting and stimulating. And we'll also say more about that dynamic of rewards in just a bit, but this dynamic with digital technologies doesn't merely impact our sleep. These seemingly innocuous dings and pings and flashes of light can even impact issues like conception. There was a study that demonstrated that women who live at near busy intersections had actually lower rates of fertility as compared to women in suburban or rural settings. The reason is because of this built-in alarm system that we have. Deep down, the bodies of women living near busy intersections are responding like they're living near potential danger because of the heightened state of arousal from the lights and noises from the streets below. And the body knows that pregnancy is not advantageous in such circumstances because it's activating that fight or flight response. The irony, perhaps, to some of these tech problems is that technology is ostensibly meant to solve our problems, not create new ones or exacerbate old ones. Perhaps ironically, it even creates problems for the main problem that people would say it's there to fix, the problem of loneliness and isolation. Highlighting this problem is Sherry Turkle. In her book, Alone Together, which is the third book in a trilogy by Turkle, she acknowledges that her former two books were more optimistic about the human-tech relationship. Her study in this book is about the way that people have connected with social robots over the years. She looks at a number of examples, some of which you'll be familiar with. The human-tech relationships that she explores are with Eliza, Tamagotchi, Furby, My Real Baby, Aibo, Cog, Kismet, and Paro. In Alone Together, Turkle is not merely interested in highlighting the ways in which people come to interact with these robots as if they're sentient and had feelings, or even further, how these social robots were coming to replace nurses in nursing homes and hospices because the social robots could sit and hold people's hands. Her keen insight is not simply that this is happening and will continue to happen, but specifically that it's happening because of our unique loss of connectivity in our digital climate. As she states, our networked life allows us to hide from each other, even as we are tethered to each other. Further, she goes on, we look to the network to defend us against loneliness, even as we use it to control the intensity of our connections. And similarly elsewhere, we are increasingly connected to each other, but oddly more alone. In intimacy, new solitudes. One of the most pointed examples of how her research speaks to this idea that technology won't solve all of our problems, and in fact shouldn't, is when Turkle notes that there has been a decline in empathy correlated to the rise of digital communication. If you spent literally any time at all on social media, you know how that rings true. But Turkle describes how a researcher she knew who was writing on this phenomenon thought that what they needed to do is develop an empathy app. Turkle's thoughts on this idea, as she expresses them in the new preface to the updated version of her book, are worth quoting here at length. Quote, "We think that technology has gotten us into trouble, and we would like technology to get us out of it. As I reconsider Alone Together," her book, "here is how I see its greatest virtues. It provides materials to fight against this tempting idea. It encourages readers to see themselves as the empathy app. For this is my most fundamental belief. We are the empathy app." To reinforce this, the practices that she commends to live this out are to look again towards the virtues of solitude, deliberateness, and living fully in the moment, which can complement some of the discussion that we had from last week. There are other matters that we could say more about, such as the increase of depression and anxiety from tech use, as well as the development of kids' brains and how exposure to screens may aggravate that. Given all of this, it's no wonder why tech developers themselves have strict tech diets for themselves as well as for their families. As odd as it sounds, it's true. They know better than anyone what the work of their hands are capable of. This overview at the outset of this video sets the stage for the main issue that I want to talk about this week, which is tech addiction. To begin, we need to define what addiction is over against habits. Nir Eyal, a tech developer, explains to other tech developers how to create habit-forming software and sticky apps, as they're called, that keep people coming back without tipping over that line of intentionality to make something addictive. And he does this in his book called Hooked: How to Build Habit-Forming Products. As he explains, addictions, by definition, are self-destructive, but a habit, on the other hand, is a behavior that can have a positive influence on a person's life. Habits can be healthy or unhealthy. Addictions are broadly organized into two large categories: substance addiction and behavioral addiction. Tech addiction clearly falls into the latter of these two categories. As Eyal explains to his readers, Getting someone to keep coming back to an app involves a tried and true formula, which he calls the hooked model. This hooked model consists of 4 key parts that function like a cycle, turning back in on itself to propel the hook further. And the 4 parts are this. First, the trigger. Second, the action. Third, the variable reward. And fourth, the investment. It's the addition of that final point that keeps people committed to your software, app, website, or game that you're developing. Following investment, another trigger starts the cycle all over again ad nauseum. And I want to say a little bit more about each of these points in turn, beginning with that first step with triggers. With triggers, you have external and internal triggers. As Eyal explains, the ultimate goal of all external triggers is to propel users into and through this hooked model so that after successive cycles, they do not need further prompting from external triggers. As for internal triggers, Eyal notes that emotion, particularly negative ones, are powerful internal triggers and greatly influence our daily routines. Feelings of boredom, loneliness, frustration, confusion, and indecisiveness. He explains further, users who find a product that alleviates their pain will form strong, positive associations with the product over time. On the relationship between external and internal triggers, he writes that new habits are sparked by external triggers, but associations with internal triggers are what keep users hooked. Now for that second step, action. With action, it is important that the user have the motivation and the ability to act upon that trigger, whether it's external or internal. If they're not motivated to act or don't have any way of acting, then it's not going to happen. So ease of effort is key for the second step of action. Now that third step, rewards. The key here is variability and unpredictability. When a reward is novel, it's exciting. But if it is predictable, the excitement wears off. Variability keeps the reward something to continue pursuing. Eyal makes a further distinction between different kinds of rewards. There are rewards of the tribe, like affirmation that come from your social group, for example, or rewards of the hunt, like the reward that comes from the pursuit of something itself, and then also the rewards of the self, something like intrinsic motivation to accomplish something. An important element to all of this here is autonomy. As Eyal says, you are free to accept or refuse. He calls that the magic words. To change behavior, he says, products must ensure the users feel in control. And on the fourth and final step with investment, the key is that users have skin in the game, so to speak. If users invest time, energy, and money, they're more likely to remain loyal and be prompted back through the cycle with new triggering. An example that Eyal points to is IKEA, right? Putting the customer to work might seem counterintuitive, but the investment of time and energy leads to great appreciation for the final product. Additionally, apps where users input greater amounts of data, which takes time, or when add-ons are purchased for that app, those apps then become more valuable and meaningful to the user relative to that app's competition. The labor leads to love, as he says. Now, this is all a bit of inside baseball, right? This is one developer explaining how hooking users works to other developers, right? But what if you're hooked? And what if you want to get unhooked? As Adam Alter, a professor at New York University, explains in his book Irresistible, The Rise of Addictive Technology and the Business of Keeping Us Hooked, we know that repression and suppression don't work. As he notes, Freud first argued that people who rail against an idea are subconsciously drawn to that idea. And so in light of that, Alter explains that the key to overcoming addictive behaviors is to replace them with something else. He uses nicotine gum as an example, or using a stress ball for those who want to bite their nails. And he explains that the reason why these work is because they are a distraction. As Alter explains, and consider Nir Eyl's hooked model as I go over this, changing habits is fundamentally about switching out the actions but maintaining the triggers and rewards. The action should be swapped out for a distraction. This is known as the golden rule of changing habits. As an illustration of this golden rule, which is all about replacement, Alter notes that there's a company called Realism, which makes products that are shaped like a smartphone and that feel like a smartphone, but they actually can't do anything. The point of the device is to help smartphone users by offering them a distraction that they can use to switch out that habit of always needing to pull out their phone for every little thing. The trigger and the reward stay the same, but the routine or that action of taking out the phone for pictures and uploading them to social media is now replaced by looking at whatever is actually in front of you through the lens of this realism device. But what if you've not merely got a habit that you want to kick, but an addiction? Can we speak of tech addiction? Should we speak of tech addiction? Well, Sherry Turkle, again at MIT, says no. She prefers not to speak of tech addiction because of how pervasive technology is. You can't quit the internet or remove yourself completely from technology, right? She explains her position like this. The addiction metaphor fits a common experience. The more time spent online, the more one wants to spend time online. But however apt the metaphor, we can ill afford the luxury of using it. Talking about addiction subverts our best thinking because it suggests that if there are problems, there is only one solution. And of course, that one solution that she is referring to is complete elimination. And since that's not possible, right, she's saying, we shouldn't even talk about addiction. Well, in my view, there are a few problems with this. First, what makes tech addiction a thing is whether it parallels other behavioral addictions. If it parallels other behavioral addictions, then tech addiction is truly a form of addiction and not a metaphor. And second, speaking of metaphors, the language of metaphor reduces the plight of the situation. And third, it is not the case that the only way to combat behavioral addiction is complete abstinence. I think it partly goes back to what we were just talking about with the realism device and replacing with a distraction. And on this point about comparing it to other behavioral addictions, a study of gamblers who frequent casinos demonstrated that the activation of the pleasure center of the brain was happening while playing, there's the action, rather than when receiving a payout, reward. The idea being that longing for a reward is getting stronger than actually receiving it. The study revealed that what draws us to act is not the sensation we receive from the reward itself, but the need to alleviate the craving for that reward. In other words, alleviating the trigger that prompted them to action. This example from gambling can absolutely parallel the addictive use of our smartphones, social media, and other digital technologies. Even if we're not technically addicted, how often are we prompted by triggers like boredom, depression, or anxiety to check to see if there's a new notification? In fact, one hypothesis about the link between depression and excessive tech use is that people with depression alleviate the internal trigger of depression with tech use. And so a vicious cycle is perpetuated where the trigger of depression leads to tech use, and either the quality of the social interactions or the nature of the news being consumed, think of doom scrolling, for example, leads to even more depression, and then the cycle perpetuates itself. Mari Swingle, a therapist with a background in neuroscience who specializes in a field of applied psychology called electroencephalography and neurotherapy, writes from her clinical perspective and experience in her excellent book, iMinds 2.0, How and Why Constant Connectivity is Rewiring Our Brains and What to Do About It. What she does is she stresses moderation in all tech use, emphasizing the distinction between integration, using tech wisely, and interference, when tech interferes with human connection and connection with the natural world. She explains that although it took some time to be officially listed as such, extensive internet use and extensive screen time is now regarded as a behavioral addiction. She says, quote, "Placing this in the map of disorders or pathology, we now see that excessive usage of digital media has a concrete relationship to attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, ADHD, autism spectrum disorders, and almost all forms of mood deregulation, including anxiety, depression, and anger management, other forms of addiction, insomnia, and all behaviors on the obsessive compulsive spectrum, and now even personality distortion and disorders." She states that escaping to iTech will exacerbate rather than solve or soothe an individual's original problem. As she explains further, the central concept in behavioral addiction, as opposed to substance addiction, is that the lure has little to do with the outcome. Rather, it is the intrigue, the high, offered by the procedure itself. And this reminds us of the gambling from a moment ago. The behavior evolves into addiction, Swingle contends, as the individual is thereafter driven to the behavior regardless of negative outcome. Addiction, she says, is the relentless pursuit of something negative, behavior or substance, that is pursued with disregard for its potential to harm. She contends further that what is addicting with iTech is not merely what one is doing via the screen, but actually the screen itself. What you are doing could be completely arbitrary. It is the delivery system, how anything is delivered by screen-based devices, and how your brain and your person react to said delivery cycle. Yes, we feel calm, she goes on, when we engage with the screen, but for the opposite reason. It is feeding the need for arousal. That's that trigger. And the more we have, the more we want. What fundamentally marks something about tech as being problematic is when it minimizes human interaction and experiences out in nature. Mari Swingle ends her book emphatically by acknowledging that we need more human touch, human engagement, and connection with the wider world of nature. iTech, she says, should not replace human interaction or human process. That if we choose technology, it should be in addition to, not replacement for, things like educators or parents. And here she concludes her book with her own bit of advice related to technological habits, practices, and disciplines. This is what she says. "All evidence now points to the need for less screen time and more nature and people time. The antidote to all is actually deliciously simple. A lot more of nature and a lot more of each other." I recognize that a lot of what we've discussed in this lecture is pretty heavy and kind of bleak. As for some takeaways from this discussion, before we conclude, I want to offer some things. To start, I think we need to take tech addiction seriously. If we detect tech addiction in ourselves or in our loved ones, there are organizations and services out there for help. To name just one example briefly, there is an organization called Restart, which is a facility designed to help people who are addicted to video games in particular. Additionally, for those of us who know that we have some bad habits when it comes to technology, How do we find the right habits and practices and disciplines to help us combat those bad habits for the sake of our own personal flourishing and indeed our discipleship to Christ? In other words, we might not be addicted to technology in terms of a diagnosis, but we might still find tech addicting and need to be proactive in our stance towards technology for the sake of being balanced people and disciples. Along these lines, I'm curious to know how you're all finding the weekly techno habits. Are certain ones going better than others? Are we noticing them having a positive effect on our physical or mental health? Or are some of them creating new anxieties for you? As you reflect on those questions, think about this with me for a moment. When you observe your own tech use in the light of the hooked model, right, that we talked about in this lecture, what triggers lead you to pull your phone out from your pocket? What triggers cause you to check social media or email? And now consider what triggers, let's say, prompt you to pray or ask for prayer. What triggers, so to speak, cause you to pull out your Bibles? How often are you triggered to do those things, and what is it that stirs you towards them? I suspect that the two things that are probably true for most of us when we consider these two different sets of triggers is this. The sets of triggers are probably different, and the things that trigger us towards tech use half the time might be misdirecting us from what we truly need. As you think about where our techno habits have been helpful or where you're finding them to be a nuisance, how does this content here that we're discussing lead you to think about what having intentional conversations about tech habits could look like in your families or your churches? If we're going to take some of this seriously as something that we need to consider for appropriate human flourishing and even specifically Christian discipleship, how should we broach this topic without sounding like Luddites or like we're technologically backwards? I leave this lecture with these questions for us to take up and consider together in our Flipgrid discussion this week. Let's consider these matters constructively and creatively with an eye towards the different types of contexts in which this conversation is needed. And I look forward to that discussion with all of you. Cheers.